Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in our second series of CGS-CIMB Thoughts, What It Means to be Progressive in This Age, featuring Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram. And we are honored to have Professor Dr. Jomo with us today, together with Puan Ruzi Ajith, CEO of CGS-CIMB Securities Sundaram and Ms. Michelle Chia, our Chief Economist, and also our moderator for today. We'll start the event by having an opening remark by Puan Ruzi, then followed by the conversation with Professor Jomo and Michelle. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do have any questions, please post them on the chat box and we will try to get them answered as we go along. So without further delay, let me pass the stage to Puan Ruzi Ajith, CEO of CGS-CIMB Securities Sundaram for the opening remark.
Thank you, Chime. Malaysia has come a long way since our independence in 1957. We now have top talents known worldwide. We have thrived and endured the best and worst economic cycles. And most recently, we found ourselves in a new state of affairs. As we grow and shape our future, we ask, how can we be the best form of ourselves? To be a robust, progressive, and a high-impact society. With these questions and spirit in mind, we feature to you today's topic on what it means to be progressive in this age. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our CGS-CIMB Thoughts Leadership Series. In the spirit of aspiring for greater good of future Malaysia, we present to you Thoughts, a brainchild of CGS-CIMB. Thoughts is a social impact platform to address imminent issues affecting Malaysia. Today, we are very honored to have with us Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Professor has been a big advocate of progressive policy making, having been invited to many exclusive events to share his thoughts and ideas of various imminent issues in Malaysia. Prof also the research advisor at Khazanah Research Institute, a visiting professor at Initiative for Policy Dialogue, University of Columbia, and founder chair of IDEAS. Prof has a wealth of experience in social economic space, both locally and internationally, as a former economic professor and was United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. In 2007, he received the Worsley Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. For your information, Prof, the audience with us today are investing community within CGS-CIMB clientele and youth of financial industry and university students. Without taking much more time, I would like to pass the floor to you, Prof, in conversation with our Chief Economist, Michelle Chia, to share with us your thoughts and wisdom. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Ruzi. Assalamualaikum to your audience, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with CGS-CIMB, and I look forward to the conversation with Michelle.
Right, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle, and thank you for joining us in the second installment of the CGS-CIMB Thought Leadership Series. We're honored, of course, to have Professor Jomo K. Sundaram here today to share his insights accumulated from his multifaceted career in academia, international agencies, NGOs, as well as public service. Those, of course, who follow Professor Jomo, his writings and research, know him to be a keen observer, a critical thinker, and a leading authority on economic development and policy making. And I'm sure we can look forward to an engaging conversation on today's topic of the day, which is what it means to be progressive in this age. We hope to create a forum that's going to be interactive, and we invite the audience to join us in a multi-way discussion. So if you would like to pose a question to the professor or offer comments on the topic, please submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will be collating the questions as we go along on this conversation. So now, Professor, let's begin with a bit of etymology. Of course, I think it'll be useful for the audience if we sort of break down the word what it means to be progressive. The word progress, of course, comes from Latin origins, progressus, meaning to go forward. To be progressive, of course, can refer to seeking advancements in the human condition. And it could also mean, in a more contemporary political context, to mean a push for social reforms and the betterment of society. So I guess maybe to start us off, I would maybe invite you to help us frame the parameters of today's discussion. And what does this notion of being progressive mean to you, Prof?
Thank you very much. And that's a tall order for what is meant to be a series of brief questions and brief answers. But let me try to, as you correctly point out, progress is something which is often been talked about. The term begins in, if you look at the map, the flag of Brazil, it says order and progress. And actually, many people would find that to be a contradiction in terms. How do you have progress while maintaining the old order? So, you know, in a sense, you're always pushing against it. And because Brazil is also known for football, you could say that it tends to be a slogan which is kicked around a lot. But in the contemporary context, I think there are two things which might be said. One, I think it's important to recognize that the progressives in the world today see themselves as different from the liberals. And earlier today and in the last few months, I've been very active in trying to get us to reconsider the relevance of Vision 2020, which Tun Mahathir expounded in 1991, but which was largely abandoned by around 1998 with his falling out with Anwar Ibrahim. Now, within the Malaysian context, I think it is important to recognize that what progress means is very context specific, and what may be progressive at one time can be regressive at another point. So, for example, I think for many people, the ability to control nature, to allow, to ensure that nature does not overwhelm us, for us is something which is seen as progressive. But at a certain point, when we are able to control nature so well that we start abusing nature, that becomes, in a sense, regressive. And so so progress is always very context specific. Generally, we think of knowledge as enhancing our ability to understand things. But we also know that a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing because people think they know when actually they don't know. Let's look at the controversy, the kinds of people who are in the anti-vaxxer movement. There's a lot of stuff there, partly drawing from little knowledge or little things, and then it being used. But particularly in the Western context, I think the liberalism of the last couple of centuries at least has been very much associated with a view that the liberal economic order, market forces, and so on would basically work out to be in the human interest. But actually, this is again a misreading of history, because Adam Smith, for example, never really believed that. Adam Smith, the term invisible hand only appears once in a footnote in The Wealth of Nations. But people talk about it usually without reading The Wealth of Nations, that as if the whole book is about the invisible hand ensuring benign outcome for all of us. So progressives have seen themselves in the recent period as offering alternatives, context-specific alternatives to enhance particularly the human condition. But the rise and the greater appreciation of the complexity of the relationship between humanity and nature has forced us to rethink our relationship to nature, and to think that control of nature is not necessarily the most desirable thing, that rather we need to become less anthropocentric, less human-centric, but much more appreciative of the larger order of things. So the concept of progress actually is quite a complicated and very context-specific view, very context-specific in meaning. And this, I think, is something which we need to begin to recognize much more. So within the context of Malaysia today, it actually means many different things to different people. But I would say that the advancement of knowledge, the advancement of science, science over superstition, science over backward thinking, and the recognition that progress is better than regression. But that's an easy one, okay? Because very often in life, you may make 2 steps forward, but at the same time, you take 1 step back. You know, life is not a series of progressions. And this, I think, is important for us to recognize. But I think that was a much longer answer than you ever wanted.
No, I think that was a fantastic way to set us off. And I think those are all very interesting points. And I will certainly come back to many of them as we get through the conversation. But I sort of wanted to zero in upon what you mentioned about the contextual nature of progression, of progressiveness. And, you know, we've seen how leadership and perhaps a lack of it can greatly influence the outcomes in organizations. We've seen how countries as well as companies can thrive with the abundance of leadership that is progressive, and conversely also suffer from an absence of it. What do you think are the characteristics of organizations that can help foster these sort of traits to move us in the direction that you mentioned earlier? Are there sort of traits that tend to be very embedded, or are they sort of traits that can be cultivated depending on the society in which we live in? And is Malaysia conducive to those sorts of traits taking hold?
That's another thought, Michelle. One cannot talk about organizations as an undifferentiated, as if there's a single homogeneous organization. So what an organization which may at a particular point in time represent progress or symbolize progress can eventually become moribund. It can become an impediment to further progress. And I think this is something which has long been recognized. I mean, the transition, let us say, from slavery to other forms of social organization was generally seen as good. But those other new forms of social organization, although not involving slavery, may in turn become regressive. So if you think, for example, about slavery and then the transition to serfdom, serfdom is, of course, you have a greater sense of nominal freedom, but at the same time, you are still a serf, a servant of the Lord. And you know, is that necessarily something you want to permanently, have? And likewise, if you have an industry leader which induces competition and stirs up change, but after a while, I mean, very often firms try their very best to grow and innovate precisely in order to stay ahead of others. And then once you get into a monopolistic position, you can actually hold back progress because you are doing everything possible to retain your number one position. And this I think becomes hugely problematic. And then if you think of a relatively smaller economy such as Malaysia, where you have, you take something like antitrust legislation, you're trying to avoid situations, but when you have a relatively small economy and you can only produce so much of anything for the domestic economy, you obviously cannot legislate too strongly against on an antitrust basis. Because what happens in a small country like Malaysia is very different from what is possible in a place like the US. Okay, so you have to begin to think about, again, as you said, the context really matters a lot. You really have to think about how we ensure an environment which is generally progressive. And this is where I want to come back to the distinction between progressives and liberals. Liberals often think of themselves as advocating market solutions, as representing the free market, as advocating free markets. But in fact, for all intents and purposes, if you think about what is called neoliberalism of the last 4 decades or so, that neoliberalism has been more concerned about property rights being expanded. Intellectual property rights hardly existed before, 4 decades ago. But now that's what countries do. And there are companies which do trolling to buy crucial patents. They buy a whole range of patents relatively cheap in order to block other companies from moving up. Because then they can, by doing so, by holding these crucial patents, they can block other companies from innovating and so on and so on. And they can charge a toll, okay, just like the so-called Norwegian troll sits at the one end of the bridge and basically charges anybody who wants to cross that bridge to have access to in this case to the patent, to the technology. So you can see how systems which are actually meant to contribute to innovation, intellectual property rights, actually end up doing precisely the opposite, blocking innovation, because the scope of these laws are so vague that you can effectively block. And so you have somebody like, I don't know whether you remember this character called Martin Shkreli from a few years ago. Martin Shkreli was this, whiz kid. He made a lot of money at a very early age. And then he bought this drug which is very essential for people who have certain health problems. And he bought that drug, and the drug was previously selling for $12.50. And he raised the price to $750. Okay, 6,000% or 60 times the original price. And he claimed that it was to induce even more innovation, to fund more innovation. But if you look at his company, nothing was spent on actually R&D. So you have all these kinds of excuses. So in the case of Malaysia, for example, we have access to a generic drug produced by an Egyptian company, which costs for hepatitis C. There are about 500,000 people in Malaysia who have hepatitis C. And that drug is available to Malaysians for about 1,300 ringgit, as opposed to almost 3,000 ringgit if you buy the American version of that drug. So you can see the huge contrast. But this was originally meant to induce innovation, to induce R&D in the pharmaceutical world and so on. And so now you have this cutthroat competition going on to decide to get pole position, to get leading position as far as vaccines are concerned, and anything else which can make money. We have, for example, a situation where the top 10 billionaires in the world have made so much money they can fund all the vaccines for everybody in the world several times over. But nobody wants to tax them. Nobody wants to get the money from them.
And I guess my question to that, Professor, is, have the well-intended systems that we've built since basically the post-war period, have they evolved beyond the point where they can be controlled for all these excesses? And, what do you think institutions have to do to keep up? Do they have to evolve in order to ensure that there's some sort of strictures from the overreach of basically capitalism?
Yeah, but I think it's very important, Michelle, that, you hit the nail on the head when calling the beast we are up against capitalism. But I think there's capitalism and there's capitalism and there's capitalism, okay? And I think, for example, capitalism is the only game in town in the world today. Okay, I mean, leaving aside North Korea, and anyway, I mean, the Chinese say that they have socialism under with Chinese characteristics, but quite frankly, I think most people would call it capitalism with Chinese characteristics.
Yep.
Okay, so you have the curious situation where the Communist Party of China been very successful in accelerating the development of capitalism in China. But people might say, oh, how is this possible? Well, the same thing has happened actually in Italy. Emilia-Romagna, one of the most dynamic places in Italy. The Communist Party was ruling in that part of Italy for many, many decades. And the reason they were so popular was because they were being supported by the medium and small size capitalists. Because the small and medium capitalists found that the kind of government which you found in Emilia-Romagna, sometimes they call it the third Italy, was actually very, very supportive of small and medium capitalists. So I think it's very important to recognize that even if you say that capitalism is the only game in town, there are different ways you can organize capitalism. And one of the big problems, if you read the Harvard Business Review in the last decade or so, there's a lot of concern about the ascendance of finance. I know you guys are in finance, but the ascendance of finance has led to a lot of behavior where finance, as Keynes would put it, finance should be the handmaiden of capital. But finance has actually become the master of capital. So much so that sense, capitalism today is better described as finance capital. Now, about a century ago, there was a German finance minister, Rudolf Hilferding, who actually wrote a book called Finanzkapital. But that was a very different time because he was talking about the domination of banks in the German situation. In the world today, including Malaysia, we do not have that kind of domination by banks. And in a sense, we have a very curious situation where, in a sense, the stock market, where you cannot say that there is a single individual behind the stock market, but it is the stock market which in a sense rules and prevails, in many parts of the world. And then you have perverse behaviors. You have what William Lazonick described in the Harvard Business Review as as situations where, due to the low interest rates which prevailed in the last decade, many companies or many powerful people borrowed very, very cheap from banks and other financial institutions, and then basically took their companies off the market. This is a very American phenomenon. It's not so widespread in Europe or in other parts of the world, but nonetheless, it is a very curious situation where, in a sense, you can even say that the adults were eating the young.
Yeah.
In a very perverse kind of way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this was a lesson that perhaps came out of the previous global financial crisis surrounding the financial markets, which was, when they were left to self-regulate, basically they just threw a party and caused the system to go into a crisis. And I guess, I sort of want to bring that back to this notion about at what point do the institutions and the fail-safes in an economy have to step in to make sure that excesses aren't being created? And when we talk about policy making, and you certainly alluded to this earlier when you mentioned about needing to advance science and fact-based reasoning over superstition and untruths. We know that we live in a world where information travels at light speed with the internet and digitalization. But when we talk about applying a progressive mindset policy formulation, be it in a company or an organization or in government, we know that problem solving is a function of diversity of ideas. But how do you sort of distill the right ideas from the wrong ideas? And I guess, maybe to put it more specifically, in the course of your work, what were the conditions that you found were the most conducive to creating the environment for the right ideas to come to fruition, as opposed to ideas which, uh, uh, create negative externalities, such as the examples that you mentioned, like in the drug pharmaceutical segment. How do we sort of ensure that the right ideas are being applied and are being discussed in a public way?
Okay, as you know, I've had a very mixed career. Okay, so as a professor, my main task was to encourage people to think critically. Okay, so in a sense, I was iconoclastic. You don't indulge people, even when they try to flatter you. It's very important, that you be able to resist flattery and so on, and begin to continuously be able to be self-critical, including of oneself. If one cannot recognize one's own mistakes, I think we are really doomed. And this is a problem I must say I continue to struggle with, even at this stage. But I think I think one of the important lessons for me has been this whole COVID period, because this whole COVID period has forced me to do two things, which I never thought about doing very much in the past. One is I have to constantly revise my ideas, because we are learning so much as we go along, about the nature of the virus, about the nature of vaccines, about the nature of tests, and so on and so forth, and the shortfalls thereof. And the fact that the virus can mutate keeps on changing the rules as well. So it really forces you to get away from preconceptions. And it also, I think this whole episode has also forced me to recognize that the kinds of silos we often think it, the silo of economics and so on and so forth, are really, really limiting. So the ability to absorb a great deal of information, but unfortunately, you do not have artificial intelligence systems to do that kind of integrative thinking for you. So there are no easy answers to the challenge you pose. There are no easy ways to do that. But I think that has been one important experience. But the other important experience I've had working at the UN for 11 years was to try to find common ground, because I had I couldn't afford to have anybody getting angry, upset with whatever position I took. Okay, so I had to explain it. I had to keep on finding positions which are not necessarily my preferred solutions, but a solution which might be acceptable to all. And that's often easier said than done, to find solutions which are acceptable to all. Because I would lose my job if I offended, even a small block of small countries can have a lot of weight, because it's basically a democratic system where one country, one vote kind of thing. But of course, you can't offend the big boys as well. So that is important. So you begin the task of making your arguments, making them simply free of jargon as far as possible, and trying to explain to people why it might be in our best interest to be a bit more empathetic, be a bit more. So just to give you an example, during the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, we drafted a call for a global Green New Deal. And I had to persuade the rich countries that it was in their interest to subsidize poor countries. And basically the argument is as follows. You have poor countries where over 1 billion people in the world today are energy poor, in the sense that they don't have access to modern energy, modern meaning electricity. So they indulge in a lot of behaviors which are not necessarily in the best interest of global warming, for instance. So you burn a lot of biomass, etc., etc. But what are the alternatives? They don't have any other alternatives. So one alternative is to get them electricity. But the cheapest forms of electricity are coal and so on. So how do you induce them to get away from fossil fuel burning and to get the renewable sources of energy? At that time, even though the price of photovoltaic solar panels had come down a lot, it was still cheaper to go with coal, especially since you already had your coal-fired plants. So you needed to subsidize the use of photovoltaic, so that countries which are poor countries will use photovoltaic solar panels instead of something else. And this was the kind of inducements which we needed to come up with. And we persuaded the rich countries that by doing so, since at that time, they control most of the technology, they were producing most of the photovoltaic solar panels. And now, more than a decade later, the situation has changed. Malaysia is the single largest exporter of photovoltaic solar panels, but not a single Malaysian company is involved in this. It's all foreign companies, European, Chinese companies, and American companies. So we really need to, time and tide are not going to wait for us. We need to be able to be seriously entrepreneurial, or as the Latin slogan goes, carpe diem, seize the time, seize the day. This is absolutely essential. And so we need that kind of dynamism in capitalism. If you don't have that kind of dynamism in capitalism, it's not worthwhile having capitalism.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, even though I am from the financial circles and when we look at the sort of impact that we've seen on economic cycles, and even during this COVID-19 crisis, there has clearly been very unequal outcomes for different segments of the population, depending on, whether you can work remotely or whether you have to be physically present in your workplace, whether you have access to savings or whether you have access to social safety nets. And I think, I guess, when we draw sort of parallels with what you mentioned about the advanced economies holding intellectual property and holding the rights to technology, and we draw parallels to the current situation with regards to vaccine developments, and we can see how, in terms of the procurement process, how effectively certain advanced economies have the ability to cut the queue, to get to the front of the queue, even though the virus doesn't discriminate when it comes to who it infects. I guess maybe if I could ask for your view on how this current COVID-19 crisis, how have we actually handled the crisis in terms of policy making? Have we largely made the right decisions? Or do you think there are policy successes which should be celebrated and also policy failures which should be pointed out and corrected? And, are we getting the balance right between protecting lives and protecting livelihoods?
Yes, I think, if I may say so rather bluntly, the choice is a false choice. Yeah, the choice is between lives and livelihoods is a false choice. And I'll try to come back to that later. But I think again, it's very difficult to make a judgment, to pass judgment. And I really want to get into a finger pointing exercise or anything like that. But I think, when you think back about the last year, when COVID-19 began, nobody really knew what to do. We were groping, trying to figure out what to do. And incredibly, just before Chinese New Year, at the beginning of last year, the Chinese government recognized the gravity of the situation. And they imposed, at a very sensitive time, they imposed a stay-in-shelter lockdown in Wuhan city and the provinces around Wuhan, because Wuhan city has been the industrial hub of China for many decades now. or possibly up to a century. And so you have a lot of people who actually live outside of Wuhan city, but commute not only from Hubei province, but also the other provinces nearby. You know, it's a bit like New York City. You know, you have people who live in New Jersey, people who live in Connecticut, who commute every day almost to work in Wuhan. So this was so the Chinese introduced that, but so there was a tendency to think that this was the only way to deal with it. But when you think about what happened in China itself, outside of Wuhan, all the other provinces of China and Wuhan and the 3 surrounding provinces, outside of those 3 provinces, there has never been a stay-in-shelter lockdown, or what we in Malaysia call an MCO. Japan, the second most affected country was actually Korea. Okay, Korea never had, not even in Daegu, the city where COVID-19 began with this Christian cult, which was meeting secretively and so on. And in Korea, no stay-in-shelter lockdown. Japan, none. Taiwan province, none. Vietnam, none. In fact, until towards the end of until almost the end of last year, not a single death in Vietnam. Even in Laos, the poorest country in Southeast Asia, none. In Kerala, none. So everybody else found a way. The situation had run out of control in Wuhan, and arguably that was the situation which we faced here as well, because we were trying to figure out what the situation was, and mistakes were made and whatnot, and basically maybe a stay-in-shelter lockdown and MCO was needed to so-called flatten the curve. That might have been necessary at that point. The relief measures were partial, but at least good, in the sense that they were better than nothing at all. There were many people, I've often emphasized, the daily rated workers, as well as very small businesses, you know, family businesses and so on, who were basically not provided much relief. Others were provided much better relief and so on. People in the public sector and so on. Now, that was, and then you had the so-called Punjana thing. But after that, unfortunately, we scored a lot of own goals, to use a football analogy. Okay, I mean, you know, it was so apparent. Just south of the causeway, Singapore made a huge mistake by ignoring the foreign workers. And the so-called second wave in Singapore was largely a story driven by foreign workers. And the workers they were, and the people they were most in contact with, people in old age homes and so on and so forth. You know, that was a tragic situation in Singapore. Now, you know, unfortunately here, and to be fair, it wasn't the Ministry of Health people, but others who refused to do anything as far as the foreign workers are concerned. Now, 1/3 of the labor force in Malaysia, whether you like it or not, comprises of foreign workers. 2/3 of the foreign workers in this country are here, are undocumented. They do not have them. So you can say, oh, they should be documented. You know, you can do all that, but in an emergency situation, that's not the kind of thing you do. You know, you have to. The virus is not going to discriminate on the basis of what passport you carry. You know, so unfortunately, there was not enough done there. And then there were a number of other major errors. Now, undoubtedly, the cost of the most reliable tests, the so-called PCR tests, are quite high. There's no doubt about that. But there were also other tests available, perhaps not as accurate, but not that the PCR test was 100% accurate. No, far from it. But the other tests were perhaps slightly less accurate. Okay, and the antigen test and so on. But antigen and all these other tests allow you, because they are much cheaper, they allow you to test far more people and perhaps to even test more than once. And the problem with this kind of thing is that about half the people who are infected may not know they're infected because they're asymptomatic. I have a friend who unfortunately passed away almost 2 months ago. Her son continues to be distraught because he infected his mother without realizing it, because he was completely asymptomatic, and his mother died. And he is traumatized until now as a consequence of this. So you have a lot of other consequences, but focusing on the situation, we see that, for example, Sabah, which had the state election and a spike in cases in Sabah, they have been able to bring down the number of cases, partly because they are the place where the most antigen testing is being done. So they are testing many more people, they're catching many more people, they're doing whatever is needed. Because of this, apparently now people say, and I've been shown a document, I don't know whether it's true, saying that the government is only testing for people who are symptomatic in Peninsular Malaysia. Okay, and this is, in my mind, I can understand why, but it's not, you cannot do that. You simply cannot do that, because as the great Donald used to say, yeah, we can bring down the number of cases by testing less, but what does that achieve? It's like an ostrich mentality, putting your hand in the sand, and then pretending that problems don't exist.
Yeah, it doesn't address the core problem. Yeah, agreed.
Yes, so, we have a lot of problems now are unforced errors. Okay, earlier errors, perhaps out of ignorance, out of naivete, we were all learning, and I don't think it's fair to be too harsh and critical about whatever errors were made at the outset. But now we have had a lot of experience, and Malaysia particularly has had so many viral epidemics over the last 2 or 3 decades. You think about Nipah, you think about SARS-1, you think about H1N1, avian flu, etc., etc. We should have had much more experience.
Professor, what do you think is the best way forward? Of course, like you mentioned, we can't divorce the health and economic aspects of this crisis. But given where we are today and the fact that we can't really turn back time, what is the best course of action going forward?
Well, I think there's not a single course of action. There are a number of related things which need to be done. I think first and foremost, we have been calling for a long time for an all-of-government approach. Right now, the way the whole problem is being handled is largely led by the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Home Affairs, okay? For whom the spokesperson is actually not the Minister of Home Affairs, but rather the Senior Minister of Security, okay? So you have this very perverse situation where many ministers don't even feel part of the decision-making process. The fact that you have cabinet meetings every week does not address this problem. I mean, it takes a simple question such as education. Okay, we've been living with this problem for about 10 months now, and provisions for children, school-going children, have not really significantly improved. Okay, we are going to lose a whole year of the lives of many of these children simply because they do not have the kinds of equipment which you need to be able to follow classes online. And the vast majority, over 90% of children, simply do not have that kind of equipment. It's not just a question of having better internet usage, cheaper internet, affordable internet usage. If you don't have the equipment, what are you going to do? And for multi-children households, who's going to get access to the instrument at what particular time, and so on and so forth. So there are older, tried and tested methods, involving television, involving radio, and so on and so forth, which they might not be 21st century, okay? But why should we get into this thing of, we are the most sophisticated, we are the ones who dealt with this? This is the mentality of what in Malay is called jago kampung. You really are not thinking big. You're thinking petty. And unfortunately, so we need an all-of-government approach. We also need a whole-of-society approach. And the fact that you do not involve and inform and educate the public has meant that you have the public basically being subjected to a lot of superstition, a lot of fake news, a lot of religious misteachings. I mean, you have a very curious situation where the same propaganda is being used by some fundamentalist Christians and some Muslims, you know? I mean, it's the same thing, you know, it's just you might have the Lord's Prayer at the end in one case, and you may have something else in Arabic at the beginning in the other case. But, you know, it's the same kind of propaganda because people are learning, just taking each other's stuff without doing much of the homework. But it is very influential. So you have so many anti-vaxxers, for instance. I'm not saying that we don't have a critical view about vaccines, but the kind of anti-vaccine propaganda which is so influential now is precisely because you don't trust society, you don't involve society into understanding the problem. The police cannot go around policing everybody. What are regulations are called SOPs. You know, a standard operating procedure is not a regulation, you know, and people are getting very confused by what is a regulation, what is an SOP a regulation, you know, and so there's a lot of confusion. But if you informed people better, you trusted people better, and so on, and there are a whole bunch of people who are really willing to help. They're really willing to help. And, you know, particularly in the health community, there's a lot of selflessness, a lot of sacrifice, which is happening. And that's why I hesitate in saying anything critical because, you know, at the end of the day, people will blame the health personnel, when in fact, the problem is not with the health personnel. It's a problem with policy decision makers who often don't even understand the issues very well, but are trying to score political points and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I want to take this opportunity to sort of broaden out the issues that you had discussed into beyond just COVID-19 into maybe talking about the state of the country. Clearly, your comments have prompted some questions from the audience, and this one reads, Dr. Jomo, what would be some of the practical solutions that the government or society can adopt in addressing the immediate concerns to our lack of progressiveness? You know, are there things that we can do and change to ensure that, you know, when it comes to making the right decisions in terms of formulating the right policies, we don't fall into the same traps again?
One of my great disappointments with the last government, the PH government, was that they did not bring back attention to Vision 2020. I think the Vision 2020, although it was abandoned after the Asian financial crisis in '98, was a very far-sighted document which attempted to address problems of the implementation of the NEP on the one hand, but also the social and political divisions which had hit the country, not only between communities, but even between Sabah and Sarawak and the peninsula. These are all important issues which demanded attention, but unfortunately they were reduced into formula. But that in itself was not such a huge problem. But by abandoning Vision 2020 from 1998 onwards and not reviving it in 2018, I think we lost a huge opportunity to try to change the conversation in this country. Of course, it did not help that you have a long legacy of ethno-populism in the world, and especially in Malaysia. And this, unfortunately, has been reinforced by the turn towards ethno-populism in other societies. Look at the ruling party in, say, India. Look at the last president of the United States, and so on and so forth. So what you find is that ethno-populism has been legitimized by the ascendance of such politicians. So what was unusual about countries such as Malaysia and a few other countries in the world became seemingly part of the new emerging international norm. And so, you know, And usually the language of ethnopopulism is combined with a language of victimhood, you know. I mean, and so you feel a lot of people taking the self-righteously taking the high moral ground from their positions, you know. And so it's very, very difficult to address this. And but more importantly, by turning our backs on Vision 2020, we lost a huge opportunity to try to address this, as well as many other problems. You take, for example, the questions of superstition, of backward thinking, and so on and so forth. Many of these things were anticipated in the Vision 2020 statement, but unfortunately, we did not take it forward. So now that the year 2020 is behind us, I would to open up. I would like to see that kind of thinking opened up again. And it's not a question of, you know, becoming a developed nation, as many people put it, you know. It's not a question of becoming a high-income country. I mean, in Malaysia, it is by pretending that 6.7 million foreign workers are not even here, your denominator is reduced and then you can become a high-income country, right? But leaving that question aside, you know, it's not a question of income. It's a question of a psychological liberation. It's a question of moving the minds of younger generations. And I think we have lost this opportunity not only to forge a stronger nation, a more united nation, but also a nation where people are less caged by the prisons of their own minds, the prisons of narrow thinking, whether it's related to ethnicity or other kinds of things. You know, this is a big problem which we have, and there are no easy answers, but I'm not terribly optimistic given the way you know, that government was brought down, and the legitimacy of the present government actually lies precisely on this. So it's going to be very difficult. But the thin majority on which this government survives in itself is not helpful to you know, to political stability and perceptions of, you know, of political security and other perceptions which relate to the question of you know, of optimism about the future of the country. So it's a very difficult task, and I don't see the kind of, you know, when Tun Razak, before reopening Parliament in 1971, had a National Consultative Council involving a whole bunch of people trying to find a basis, and the NEP was supposed to be about creating the conditions for national unity, narrowly conceived in ethnic terms and not thinking about Sabah and Sarawak, but that was the way national unity was conceived for the NEP. Vision 2020 had a broader understanding of what was involved, and a forward-looking understanding. But even then, I think unfortunately we lost that opportunity.
You know, I just wanted to touch a bit more on that, and it also sort of ties in with one of the questions we received, which is that, you know, considering Malaysia's political and racial diversity, as well as income disparities, do you think some of the approaches that were taken, maybe espoused by Vision 2020, are they too idealistic? And do we have to perhaps take a more pragmatic approach to fixing the problems that Malaysia has? So I guess the question asks, between idealism and pragmatism, what is the path, equilibrium path that Malaysia should take in order to get the outcomes that we hope for?
But what does pragmatism mean? What does idealism mean? I don't think it was all that beyond you know, unreachable. I don't think it was unachievable. You know, it's not even as, you know, as Barack Obama would put it. It wasn't even, you know, the audacity of hope. You know, it didn't. You know, it wasn't even that. It was actually founded on a better understanding of the history of this country, Okay, not only inter-ethnic relations, but also how Sabah and Sarawak became part of Malaysia and so on. You know, all this, I think, through a historical reckoning is very feasible. If you, for example, restrict hate speech, and in many parts of the world, it's not unusual to restrict hate speech of different types, and you know, you could, so you know, the bounds of what is of idealism and the bounds of pragmatism reflect how much what you consider to be idealistic. It reflects what you consider to be pragmatic. You know, I would just push the envelope much further than you know, in terms of what is considered to be idealistic and pragmatic. In way back in 1947, when the first multi-ethnic political coalition was created between the PUTRA, the Pusat Tenaga Rakyat, and the All Malayan Council of Joint Action, headed by Tan Cheng Lock at the time. When they got together, 1947, mind you, yeah, that's a long time ago, even before I was born. Okay, that's just how long ago it was. They agreed that the notion of bangsa, they use the term bangsa Melayu, okay, not even bangsa Malaysia, as in Wawasan 2020. Bangsa Melayu was going to be determined not by genealogy. It didn't matter who your father or your mother were, not on the basis of genealogy, but your patriotism. That was, you know, in the national anthem, Tanah Tumpah Nia Daraku. Okay, that was the definition of what it meant to be Malay, and that was a definition which actually is not all that different from that. If you think about how the word Malay is used in Indonesia, less than 2% of the Indonesian population is Malay. Okay, when they use the word Melayu there, okay, or in the Philippines, you know, Jose Rizal in 1896 or 95, before he was executed, he declared, you know, that he was actually he's partly Chinese, you know, sort of Spanish, I mean the Chinese mestizo, okay, but he proudly declared that he was Malay, because for him, to be Malay was to be the part of the nation which he was struggling for independence from. So the meaning of the word Malay is not, you know, of course the words change in meaning all the time, okay? So I think it's very important for us to understand. Now, people will say, oh, Rizal was being idealist, you know. When the Indonesian language movement in 1926, I think it was, maybe it's 28, they decided to have Malay as the national language. There were two main reasons why the Indonesians chose Malay. Part of the reason was because Malay had spread to all the islands in the Nusantara, you know, whereas Javanese, because Java was essentially landbound, although Java is an island, Javanese had not spread out beyond the island. So Malay was a much more acceptable language, and the second reason was much more caste bound. You know, you had a different dialect spoken in the palace, a different dialect spoken by the farmers, whereas Malay was a language of trade, of commerce, of everybody talking to each other, and it was less caste bound. So the choice of the Malay language was a very conscious choice by the Indonesian nationalists. So I think we have to have, and in fact, it was the newspaper owners, many of whom were ethnic Chinese, who promoted the use of Malay. So, but, okay, you can say they were trying to sell newspapers, but you know, the point is that this is a history which we should be aware of, and we, you know, many things which would be seen as too idealistic now, you know, actually belies a particular understanding of history, a particular understanding of culture, belies our understanding of the history of the entire region.
Actually, that I think, Professor, you made a very interesting point, and I just want to use it as a segue into this other thought that I have. You know, for better or for worse, Malaysia doesn't exist in a bubble, and we do have neighbors, you know, beyond our borders that occupy a whole spectrum of development paths. And you know, we have obviously the one down the south of the border, which is always the A+ student, but we also have other neighbors that operate in chaotic circumstances such as ours. You know, my point is that in recent years, we have seen some of them, including the likes of Vietnam and Indonesia, clean up their act and start catching up with where we are. You know, in your opinion, is Malaysia progressing or regressing relative to our neighbors? And what do you think might happen in 5 to 10 years if we don't correct the path that we are currently on? Are we, as one questioner asked, are we on the path of becoming the sick man of Asia? And what can we do to get ourselves off that track?
You know, Michelle, I think we all have a tendency to think the grass is greener elsewhere, you know, and I would, you know, and I suffer from as well, okay? The fact of the matter is, as your questionnaire and you yourself have commented, the situation has been bad. The situation has been bad, not now, not 2018. It has been deteriorating basically since 1998, I think. You know, if you think about economic growth and progress, the high point was the decade before the financial crisis. And we have never really understood why we were doing well then. And so we have not even tried to replicate that and move forward from there. You know, and the abandonment of Wawasan 2020, in a sense, left us sort of not only rudderless, we sort of didn't know what we were trying to achieve anymore. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Mahathir years were perfect or anything like that. In fact, much of my earlier reputation was on the basis of criticizing many of the policies which were pursued during that period. But having said that, there was a sense of purpose which was introduced, especially with Vision 2020. And that sense of purpose and that sense of pride without arrogance, you know, it has been largely lost, unfortunately, has been largely lost. And we have, unfortunately, and your industry is part of the problem, we have unfortunately become, we fetishize money, to put it very crudely, you know. The value of life, the value of achievement is seen in increasingly in financial terms. This is not a problem peculiar to Malaysia, let me be very clear, you know, but unfortunately, you know, as Deng Xiaoping said, you know, to make money is to be glorious. Yeah. Or it is glorious to make money, something to that effect. You know, it sounds almost Trumpian, okay? And unfortunately, this has become the order of the world. And this has made it acceptable to have the gross inequalities which we have in the world today. So it's a huge problem, but we no longer have much appreciation for many other things in life. We don't have much appreciation of history. I mean, just take, for example, this year is the 500th anniversary of the death of Magellan, okay? And his slave, whom he had captured in Malacca in 1511, his slave was liberated by his death and his will, which said that he was to be liberated. Now his slave, whose name we don't really know, okay, becomes the first person to go around the world. Okay, now this is like a Spartacus type story, you know, where the slave becomes the hero. Okay, now a teacher in Singapore, Cikgu Harun Aminur Rashid, wrote a story fictional story to inspire young children in 1957. It was called Panglima Awang. Okay, and there's a great artist, Fuad Osman, who has actually marked and done a very nice sculpture of Panglima Awang and so on. But you know, unfortunately, who knows about all this? Who knows this? You know, you're not going to find it in your history books. You're not, and most people don't even know this. Okay, so there is much to be proud about, but it's not the story of, you know, this dynasty or that dynasty or this emperor or this sultan and so on and so forth. It is a story of ordinary people who made history. And this, unfortunately, this kind of appreciation, unfortunately, we don't really have in our culture, you know, in our society. And we need much greater appreciation of this to inspire people, especially younger people, to greater things. But greatness not measured simply in terms of how much they have accumulated and so on and so forth, but greatness in the sense of, you know, of other types of achievements, you know, artistic achievements and so on and so forth. So this is what I hope we have. And, you know, if you look at Indonesia, for example, you know, we often pride ourselves in being ahead of Indonesia and this, that, and the other. They have done tremendously in terms of innovation in recent years. You know, technological innovation, including agricultural technology. They are moving ahead in some ways. Now, Indonesia has a lot of problems. Let me not try to sweep them under the carpet, but we have the real risk of being very much left behind. We need an inspired leadership, you know, to unite the nation. And working on such projects actually serves to unite the nation. I mean, you look back at the slogans such as Malaysia Boleh and so on and so forth. It gave inspired young people with a sense of possibility, a sense of hope, and the sense of can do. You know, and I think that's a kind of leadership which is badly needed, you know, and unfortunately we are wanting. But at the very moment, very often when you think that the dark clouds are there and so on and so forth, the sun peeks out, there's a silver lining, and so on. So I don't want to be too pessimistic, you know. I think we have to be realistic that we are being left behind, but it doesn't mean that we are doomed. We can always change history.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that sort of serves as an important reminder that change is constant and we just have to adapt, whether we're on an individual basis or on a countrywide basis to changes. And I think, you know, it comes at a very interesting time because we're seeing major shifts, structural shifts that we've probably not seen for over a century, with the rise of technology, with demographic changes, with sustainability concerns and climate change. And, you know, increasingly we ask ourselves, is Malaysia prepared to face the future? And, you know, what do we need to do to future-proof ourselves? You know, are we undertaking the right policies? Are we asking the right questions? You know, in your opinion, Prof, which are the areas that you think we need to pay the most attention to ensure that, you know, we can last and thrive over the next 40, 50 years?
Okay, that's again a very tall order. Partly because, well, firstly, I disagree with the notion that we should be just adapting. You know, we are not passive objects of history. We must be subjects of history as well. But to be a subject of history, we must know what we are dealing with. And that is unfortunately lacking. It's not just good enough to be brave and want to do something without knowing what you're up against, what you're dealing with. And I also have difficulties with the notion of future proofing. You know, I think you're better off with an astrologer. You know, why bother with getting an economist, right? No, the fact of the matter is economists, you know, as you know very well, have terrible records. in forecasting, in predicting, and so on and so forth. They have terrible records. And I don't get into that game. Unfortunately, I had to do a little bit of that at the UN, but I insisted on always talking about a range of possibilities. And, I mean, it's the typical cop-out of the two-handed economist, right? On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. But the thing is that it is very important that, to recognize that things can go in many different ways, and to recognize that the outcome of all those things can be very, very what we presume them to be. I mean, this is what chaos theory sort of reminds us of. Okay? So can we future-proof? No. But I think what we need to do is to be cognizant, much, much more cognizant, and unfortunately, we're not sufficiently cognizant, I spent much of the last 2 months listening into the briefings to the Biden team, okay? Because you have all kinds of lobbies trying to further their own interests by telling the Biden team, incoming Biden team, that this what needs to be done, and so on and so forth. But the level of the debates are not clear, okay? Because you have one team doing one lobbying in one direction, another team lobbying in a different direction, and usually the lobbies don't meet, okay? But you have to imagine what is happening. So you have a clash of ideas, you have a clash of arguments, and we need to begin to understand this. But we need to begin to understand this not only of the US, but also of the rest of the world, about what is happening, for example, in China, and so on and so forth, and for that matter, Japan. But if we do not do that, and we have this, a view that, some of the rating agencies or some other people have a monopoly on the truth and can predict the future, then we are doomed. What we really need is robust debates about these kinds of issues. But unfortunately, this is very sadly lacking. And part of the problem, and why I think your industry is problematic, is because there's a vested interest. There are vested interests in telling particular stories, and so you cannot be seen to be undermining the storyline which you want to promote. So the idea of promoting a particular storyline and the idea of having an objective analysis of the facts and the trends as they appear to be are not possible, it seems to me, when in fact we should be possible. And so I think we really need to have much more robust debates and in the country and beyond the country as well, because we are, after all, very much driven by forces beyond our control.
Yeah, and how much of this, obviously having fact-based debates and informative conversations, how much of this do you think is rooted in our education system? And and I guess obviously that has an impact eventually on our human capital and how we can actually tap the labor markets to forward some of the policies that we want to adopt. How much of it do you think rests on the need to change the way our education system is structured? And also, I know you don't like the word future-proof, but obviously education is at the root of ensuring that we are fully prepared to face the industries and the disruptions of the future. So what are your thoughts, Prof, on the building out of human capital in our country and what we can do to improve it?
Well, I think strengthening human resources, I don't believe in the idea of human capital. I think it's a bogus idea. I'm beginning to sound like Trump, but it is a bogus idea, okay? There's no such thing as human capital. It's not as if, some people have been promoting the idea that you can interchange between physical capital, human capital, finance capital, natural capital, and all this. Everything becomes capital, That's a false notion, okay? nonetheless, I think one has to say that human capacities can be developed, and you can develop human resources and human capacities, and that is not unimportant, and education can play a very, very important part of it. What we have, unfortunately, is what there was a pedagogue in the 1970s, Paulo Freire, who talked about the idea of, he basically oversimplified, of course. He said there are two basic approaches to education. One is you can promote critical thinking, or two, you can promote the simple accumulation of knowledge, the simple accumulation of information, accumulation of knowledge. And so what happens when you do the latter is that you simply reinforce existing prejudices. Okay, whatever the prevailing prejudice of a particular society may be, or of a particular age, a particular time, those prejudices continue. And that's basically what happens when you have this, what he called a banking method. You know, you just simply put in more money into your bank account, that kind of thing. And so at the end of the day, you show that, you know, if you have a certain amount which you supposedly have your brain and certain skills, perhaps certain abilities, certain cognitive abilities as well. Now, I think, of course, the differences are not so stark, okay, because you often need to have the accumulation of information and knowledge in order to be able to improve your critical cognitive skills, okay? But there is a tendency to emphasize banking, the banking approach in Malaysia. And so, for example, if you think about what has been hailed for the last two decades or more as the best system of education in the world, in Finland, the amount of class time the children have is about 4 hours per day, 5 days a week, okay, with long summer vacation. You just remember, summer is very long in Finland, okay, so far north, right? And winters are very long as well. So you have, you know, an approach which basically says the more time you spend in school, the more information you can put into your thing. And I don't know whether it's your generation or the subsequent generation, where you have kids who get 16 A's at the O level, you know, and that's considered to be a mark of great achievement. But what are those 16 A's for? You know, it's basically the accumulation and the reinforcement of particular modes of thinking. Okay. So,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Professor. Sorry.
No. All I'm saying is that's not, you're certainly not going to have critical skills developed in that mode. But at the same time, to put it so starkly and say that you don't need to accumulate knowledge is also, I think, erroneous.
Yeah, and I would agree with you, because I think with the emergence of new technology like AI, like the availability of internet, basically at the snap of your hand, you have access to information and knowledge that in the past would have taken years to accumulate. And I guess, you know, it does change the nature of competition, and in particular labor competition, from perhaps the generation or two before the current one, in the sense of what are the sort of transferable skills, what are the um, traits that one would need in order to adapt to the changes that are oncoming with the new industrial revolution. And do you think Malaysia is well placed? I know in the past we've always used achievements in science and math as a benchmark of whether a country was prepared for the industrialization process. But as we enter a new period of a knowledge-intensive type of development, are those the right barometers to use? And do we need to be perhaps judging the quality of education, the quality of students that are coming out of the system in a different manner?
Well, having achieved what level I may have achieved on the basis of my mathematics skills, you know, I'm not going to run down science and math. Most of my classmates ended up as engineers and so on. So I'm not going to do that. But
do we need to go beyond that, beyond
no,
just science and math?
You know, one of the big problems in economics is that, at least for the generation just before mine, the main analogies were with physics, you know. And the generation of my classmates, I mean, Paul Krugman, who was my classmate, he basically wrote a very, I think one of his better essays was actually on proposing biological analogies. I think both biology and chemistry, but especially biology, forces us to think about transformation, change, growth, mutation in ways which perhaps are much more relevant to the physics analogy. So I think I think that drawing the appropriate analogies, and there are occasions when it makes eminent sense to talk about analogies from physics, you know, but it is the ability to have this broad appreciation, you know, which I still lack, and part of one of my great regrets in the last year is, you know, I hardly paid any attention to biochemistry, to understanding the new viruses which have been going around, and so on and so forth. You know, to understanding to understand so many things which are relevant to COVID-19, for example. You know, I had neglected that, and you know, there's nobody I can blame but myself but the ability to think about the ability to think critically, I think, is actually crucial. But thinking critically always has to be contextual. Always has to be contextual. You cannot just be, you know, what the James Dean type of rebel without a cause. You know, just you know, that's kind of mindless nihilism. You know, what we need is much more a thoughtful ways of in a sense, critical thinking, which basically enhances the process. So, so I don't necessarily, you know, the Schumpeterian view of sort of creative destruction, I don't necessarily see that as something to aspire to. But unfortunately, let's face it, in the course of human events, there are going to be processes where many things of the old are going to be discarded, and the new sometimes cannot be born without the discarding of the old, and the persistence of the old can prevent the emergence of the new. You know, I'm sure many poets and others have put that much more elegantly than I just did, but I think you get the idea of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So, you know, but how do we recognize that something is becoming a fetter to progress? You know, it's not easy, you know, it's easier said than done. And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you ended on that note, because there's actually a very spicy question that's come through from the audience, which is that you mentioned in order to progress, sometimes you need to discard the old. And this questioner asks, do you think that reforming Malaysia's constitution is a way to save the country? I know it's a controversial question, but do you think the constitution is flawed in some ways?
The constitution in our types of societies is basically created in the past by those with influence at a particular time. And the constitution, in a sense, is a So our constitution, whether we like it or not, was created by a deal between the so-called founding fathers of the Malaysian nation, or the Malayan nation to be more accurate, and the outgoing colonial masters. It was a deal which was flawed on many counts and so on and so forth. One needs to live with it. One needs to recognize that there are certain strengths, and there's a lot to be done by a lot which can be facilitated by changing it. But let's face it, most of life is not being conducted with constantly looking over the shoulder at what the Constitution says. Most of the time, we hardly know what is in the Constitution. And this can be said about many other societies as well. So I think, maybe I'm saying this because I gave up my law studies, but I think one should always recognize that law, and especially constitutions, are imperfect aspirations at a particular point in time made by particular, unfortunately, in all too many societies, by men, by elite men.
And I guess we're just about to come up to 1:30, and I'm mindful of the time. So just wanted, I know we have a number of aspiring youths and students in the audience today who I know will be the torch bearers for the next generation of progressive-minded leaders like yourself, Professor. So I think, to end things on a hopeful note, on a positive note, perhaps, Professor, you'd like to convey some parting words of wisdom to that generation, and essentially, tell them what you hope for the future.
Well, I wish I had been prepared for this. I would have found some suitable poetry or something to read at this moment. But I think I would strongly encourage people. Maybe most of your listeners are too young to remember Vision 2020, but I think the spirit of Vision 2020 is still relevant for us as we go forward, and especially as we go through some difficult times right now. But very importantly, although the grass always looks greener on the other side, and even if the grass is really greener on the other side, we have only one life. We have only one. I mean, there are a few people I'm sure who believe in reincarnation, but you essentially have one life, and you basically should make the most of it. But hopefully, not just for yourself, but also for the nation, and hopefully even for humanity. And what that means at a time when we are when people have recognized the challenges of sustainability, basically introduces new constraints in terms of what is possible, what we should be thinking about. And one of the things which is lacking in Vision 2020 is enough of a sensibility about sustainability. So we really need to rethink our relationship, not only of human to human, but also to society at large, and also to humanity at large, but also, and I want to emphasize this, to nature. And we have been we have not paid enough attention to the problems of our relationship with nature. Malaysia, the second most important item, if the CPTPP was approved, the second biggest area of imports would be actually plastics, and much of it would be waste. And more than 80% of the plastic waste being imported into this country is not being processed. It is just being dumped into landfills. So this is just one example. What is happening in Kedah and so on is another question which we need to begin to rethink about what is important in life. So while it is important to provide for ourselves and our loved ones, it is also important to realize that our lives are inextricably related to our positions in society and in the larger universe. So, I mean, at the risk of sounding slightly corny, one of the slogans I like most, I spent 3.5 years in Rome, is Carpe Diem. They seize the time, seize the hour, seize the moment.
And with that, I would like to conclude this conversation with Professor Jomo on behalf of CGS-CIMB. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Professor, and we are grateful for the time that you've taken to join us. To the audience, thank you for your participation and questions, and we hope to see you again in the next iteration of our Thought Leadership series. I will now pass the floor to the MC for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Let me pass it over to Ruzi for the closing, but thank you, Prof and Michelle, for having a great conversation. Over to you, Ruzi.
Yes, looks like we are at the end of our discussion today. I would like to thank Prof. Jomo for the very interesting, thought-provoking and inspiring discussion that you have shared with us. I would also like to thank all participants for your enthusiasm, warm engagement and support. We hope to see you again in the next Thought Leadership series. Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.